Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Добрий вечір, пані та панове. My name is Svetlana Krasinska, and I'm a doctoral student here at the School of Leadership and Education Sciences, or SOLS. I'm also a member of the Ukrainian community here in San Diego. Before I introduce our distinguished speakers tonight, I would like to express my profound gratitude to the village that came together to produce this event. First, I would like to thank the Department of Leadership Studies and the Department Chair of Sanena Hanvandi, Professor and Chair, over there. Thank you. And also the SOLS Global Center and Dean Paula Cordero, who is here in spirit, for their enthusiastic endorsement and generous support. Next, I would like to thank the 3 graduate student associations here on campus who have also been very generous with their support. And they are the Graduate Student Council, the SOLS Graduate Student Association, and Peace and Justice Graduate Student Association. And of course, very special thanks are due to the House of Ukraine, a cultural museum here in Balboa Park, and also the heart of the Ukrainian community in San Diego, as well as to the Ukrainian community itself for their financial and in-kind support, for their volunteer and outreach, and their collective contribution really makes this a community event. Finally, and last but not least, I would like to really thank the dedicated group of doctoral students at the International Third Sector Network who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes in helping pull all these wonderful resources together. And my thanks go to Kim Hunt, Corinne Brion, Jeff Bourgeois, Anna Leskinen, Elaine Lewis, and Chris Brown. Now we're here to discuss the current events in Ukraine and their implications. So it is my honor now to present our speakers. To my left, immediate left, is Dr. Taras Kuzio, a research associate at the Center for Political and Regional Studies at the Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at the School of Advanced International Relations at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Kuzio is one of the foremost Western experts on politics and economy in Ukraine and Eurasia. So among his many noteworthy official appointments he was the head of mission of the NATO Information and Documentation Center in Kyiv, Ukraine. And his most recent books, and he's written many, it would take me the next 45 minutes to list all of them, but I'll give you the most recent 3. The most recent one, Contemporary History of Ukraine, that came out in 2014. And also Changing Course Towards the European Future, 2011, and Democratic Revolution in Ukraine, also came in 2011. Dr. Kuzio is Dr. David Marples, the distinguished professor and chair in the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta, Canada. Up until this August, he was the director of the STASU program for the study of contemporary Ukraine. And Dr. Marples is also one of the leading experts on Ukraine's history and politics. And he has authored numerous books and articles about Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and the former Soviet Union. And his most recent books on Ukraine is Holodomor, Causes of Famine in 1932-1933 in Ukraine, published in 2011, and Heroes and Villains, Creating National History in Contemporary Ukraine, that came out in 2007. And finally, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator tonight, Dr. Valeria Korablyova, who is the Associate Professor in Philosophy and Humanities Department at the Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, Ukraine. And Dr. Korablyova is the author of dozens of academic texts published in Ukraine and Europe. And she's currently visiting California as a Carnegie Visiting Research Fellow at the Department of Comparative Literature at Stanford University. And her research while she's here is based on Euromaidan, the events that happened in Ukraine in the last winter. So now, without further ado, Dr. Kuzio will start our lecture.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Last time I was here was a long time ago. I won't say when, otherwise I'd be showing my age. But it's always fascinating to come to a new place, and it only works for tall people. So discrimination already. To make a civil society organization. But I'll be, the way we've divided it between I'm pretty loud, my wife tells me all the time. The way we've divided it is I'm going to be really looking at the broader domestic picture, where we've been, where we're going, and end up on national security issues, which will then transfer to David, who will talk more about the Donbass separatist crisis and relations with Russia. Now, how do I move the slides? Oh, I'm just going to take it. Okay. Yeah. The thing to remember is that, and I think, if for historians and for political scientists looking back at Ukraine, what differentiates, and Ukraine's been now nearly a quarter of a century independent. It seems, doesn't seem that long, but it is. But it seems there's been too many crises in Ukraine, and in particular the last sort of 14 or so years. In fact, in actual fact, so the Kuchma era or Kravchuk era of the 90s had a few, but in the last since about 2000, 2001, there have been far too many. And I would argue that this is a crisis, you could lump all these together as a crisis of Ukraine's elites, or ruling elites. In fact, I would argue that Ukraine's citizens and Ukraine's civil society are far more politically mature than the elites, and the elites still haven't got their heads around that. They really don't understand that factor. And in comparison to other former Soviet republics outside of the Baltic states, Ukraine has the most active civil society and the most politically mature citizens. After all, we've had 2 democratic revolutions in Ukraine, which is because of elites, not just Yanukovych, and also because of disgruntlement generally in society. So, the sources of these elites, and one of the major factors that we have to bear in mind, and whether President Poroshenko will be successful or not, is the Ukrainian society. I was just in Ukraine in October, traveled to Kharkiv and Odessa as well. Ukrainians want change. They demand change. They do not want business as usual. If there's business as usual, there will be a third Euromaidan. They will not accept that this can go on as it is until now. And one of these major factors is that the elites can no longer be above the law. There needs to be accountability. And this is where certainly President Poroshenko, we have to ask, can he do that? A lot of these issues here are not new to Ukraine. When I've been at policy-making forums in Washington, D.C., many people will smile and make jokes about how you can dust off policy proposals from Ukraine from 10 years ago and present the same ones to Ukraine, because many of these things have not been done, they've been shelved. But of course, what is key here, particularly the last 2 points, is the degree to which everything is interconnected. Because areas which you think of as being domestic factors like energy are in fact national security questions. When you have Ukraine's elites, and that's all 4 Ukrainian presidents, including Yushchenko, very closely tied to Ukraine's gas barons, and that means that they're very closely tied to Russia as well, and therefore they cannot push Ukraine towards Europe and towards NATO if they at the same time are beholden to Moscow. And so energy dependency has been a key. and that. There are no gas intermediaries today. Ukraine's in conflict with Russia about gas, but certainly energy was the most corrupt sector of Ukraine's economy. And of course, if you don't have a functioning economy, Ukraine's economy is still only 3/4 of the size of the Soviet economy in Ukraine in 1989, before you had a crash. So it still hasn't reached that size yet, because instead of the economy growing, it's a case of musical chairs when politicians have elections, trying to grab the pie as opposed to expanding the pie. And national security, that last point, is obviously key today, because Putin's regime is also corrupt and kleptocratic. But at the same time, he's a nationalist and an imperialist, and he has been investing into Russia's security forces, whereas under Yushchenko and Yanukovych, the Ukrainian armed forces were degraded. So what things have changed in the last sort of this year, shall we say, with 2 elections? Well, some things have changed and some haven't. One of the good things is that we can thank Vladimir Putin, and people joke in Kiev we should put a monument up to Putin in Kiev for helping Ukraine to have such a pro-Ukrainian parliament. It's the most pro-Ukrainian, pro-European parliament in history in Ukrainian independent state. But you have many things which have changed. You have Russian aggression, trying to do all the things that should have been done over the last 20 years in terms of reforms, fighting corruption, is now far more difficult today than it was after the Orange Revolution, when Ukraine inherited a very buoyant economy and big inflows of foreign investment. Today, Ukrainians inherited a bankrupt state from this kleptocratic regime under Yanukovych, which can be very easily defined as a mafia state. You also have very different leaders in power today in the West compared to after the Orange Revolution. You have very weak leaders throughout the Western world. My Ukrainian friends in Canada complain about Prime Minister Harper, who is all talk, no action, never mind President Obama or Western European leaders. But we can thank Putin for having at least changed the minds of some West European leaders, such as Chancellor Merkel, who is now very critical of Putin. Ukraine's political parties continue to remain weak, and certainly the question is to what degree Ukraine's oligarchs will continue to have a stranglehold on the state. And the final issue is how do you fight corruption when your judiciary and prosecutor's office are pretty abysmal and themselves corrupt? Ukraine has a prosecutor's office, just like most of these post-Soviet states, which is still in effect neo-Soviet. You have 20,000 prosecutors in Ukraine compared to 8,000 in Britain's 3 regional Crown prosecution services. And Britain has 20 million more people, and Britain's prosecutors don't wear Soviet uniforms like Ukraine's. So the prosecutor's office in Ukraine defends elites. It doesn't make them accountable to the law. So that is going to be something that has to change. Presidential, we've had 2 pre-term elections. Petro Poroshenko didn't really have much competition in May. Tymoshenko came a very bad second in terms of polling results. But Poroshenko is, for many people, the hope today. But we can't, if we're political scientists, we can't ignore his past. And everybody comes, of course, with the past. He's a founder of the Party of Regions. Everybody forgets this back in 2000. He's flip-flopped a lot, like many Ukrainian politicians have. It's not unique to him. And he's been in both Yushchenko's and Yanukovych's governments. But he did defect to the Euromaidan very early, already prior to Christmas of last year, when it wasn't clear if the Euromaidan was going to succeed or not. So he did put his neck on the line there. I don't think he's going to be like, the old, I called it the Punch and Judy show with Tymoshenko and Yushchenko, because Yushchenko always had a very strong inferiority complex vis-a-vis this very much in-your-face lady Yulia Tymoshenko. Whereas Poroshenko's very self-confident and very much a self-made man. But I think the final point is this, because you have to start fighting corruption and sending the signal out that it's no longer business as usual from the top down. Parliamentary elections. Again, as I mentioned, you can thank Vladimir Putin for having taken the Crimea, parts of Donbass, which means that about 4 million people who would have normally voted pro-Russian weren't able to vote. And that meant, that coupled with the disintegration of the party regions after Yanukovych fled Ukraine, meant that pro-European political forces, 4 out of the 6 that entered the Ukrainian parliament, 4 or 5, I forget now, are going to be able to create a constitutional majority which is pro-European. That's never happened before. The Communist Party is no longer in the Ukrainian parliament for the first time ever, and the party regions has come in the so-called opposition bloc. What is certainly going to be a big major source of discontent and protests outside the Ukrainian parliament is the fact that 70 of these sort of deputies who were elected in this so-called opposition bloc, former party regions, and elected in first-past-the-post system, which Ukraine has a mixed election system. 70 of those voted for the laws, which are called dictatorship laws, on January 16th, which transformed Ukraine from a democracy into a dictatorship and led to changing the Euromaidan into a violent uprising. It was then 4 days later that the first murders were committed of protesters. So there's going to be a lot of anger that the new lustration law should be applied to these 70 members of parliament, and for that to happen, they need to have their immunity removed from parliament first. So that's certainly going to be a major source of demand. What needs to be done? Again, a lot of these are not new to Ukraine just now. They should have been done a long time ago. Ukraine's, for example, in many of the post-communist states in Central Eastern Europe, a key area of engine of growth was always the small and medium business sector, which then increased to the European average of sort of 35 to 45% of GDP. In Ukraine, it's only sort of 17%. Much of that is probably in the shadow economy, which is so massive in Ukraine. I have an Italian mother, and Italy has a big shadow economy of 25%. Ukraine's 50%. So even if we get down to the Italian level, that will be progress. But you have state subsidies to Naftogaz, Ukrainian state energy company, consuming about 3% of Ukraine's GDP. That is just not possible to continue anymore. Show justice is being done. People are demanding, Ukrainians are demanding justice against those who murdered protesters on the Euromaidan and those who stole billions of dollars, who corporated the Ukrainian state under Yanukovych. Some of those have got into parliament in the opposition bloc. Illustration corruption, the question of whether this law, which has been applied, which has been adopted in Ukraine on illustration, will be successful or not, really is a very difficult question to answer at this moment. Very few post-communist states applied illustration. Only about 4 or 5 of the 27 post-communist states introduced illustration. In the 90s, this was primarily directed against former KGB and security service employees to weed them out. In Ukraine's case, it's both against infiltration from Russia, from Russian secret agents, which we've seen a lot of in the security services and in the military, but also of former members of the Yanukovych regime and senior members of the Communist Party. So to what degree that will be successful, because you really need to have an independent body attached to the presidency, together with parliament. A corrupt judiciary or corrupt prosecutor's office can't illustrate. So I'll go into the sort of national security aspect now, because that will lead on nicely onto David. What I think for me, I've done a lot of traveling in eastern southern Ukraine the last year or so as part of my new book project. And what to me is fascinating is that although it seems, especially with the buildup of Russian military forces in the last week or so, that Ukraine's on the defensive, at the same time we have to recognize that Putin has failed in most ways in what he sought to achieve, and that's why maybe now he's trying to change that on the ground and why the ceasefire has been so unstable. He never achieved the Novorossiya, this so-called new Russia, which illogically and historically wrong is he's applied to eastern as well as southern Ukraine. He didn't get pro-Russian uprisings in all of the 8 Russian-speaking oblasts in eastern and southern Ukraine. 6 of those didn't have any really strong support for Russia. It was only really applied to the Donbass, Donetsk, and Luhansk, which always were very different. Opinion polls always showed that about a third, 30% in both Crimea and in Donbass had sort of pro-separatist tendencies. They wanted to either create a separate state or union with Russia, and they had a very Soviet identity. Not just Russian, but Soviet identity. That wasn't the case in the other 6 Russian-speaking regions. Now, so I would divide the regions as follows, and that's why I was again in Kharkiv and Odessa in October, because the key regions in the springtime, which could have gone one way or the other, were Kharkiv and Odessa. Kharkiv is right on the Russian border. Kharkiv, the city of Kharkiv, is about 50 kilometers from the border. Russia was sending in so-called political tourists, trying to stir up violence and trying to stir up conflict. Luckily, the Minister of Interior of Ukraine, after the Euromaidan, is an Armenian Ukrainian from Kharkiv, and he was able to use his sort of police network on the ground to help to subdue that. In Odessa, it was less of the case there. It's very far away geographically from Russia, but there was tremendous conflict leading all the way up through to early May with the big fire in the trade union building on May 2nd that led to, there were 10 Ukrainians died before that, pro-Ukrainians, and then 40 pro-Russians died in the building. But those now have become relatively quiet. But these other 4 regions have never really had any pro-separatist tendencies, and in Dnipropetrovsk, we actually have a Jewish Ukraine oligarch, Igor Kolomoisky, very influential in the Jewish community in Ukraine and in Europe, who has been very good at subduing any separatist tendencies there. One of the jokes I heard in East Ukraine when I was there in October was that when you have a wedding now in eastern Ukraine, and the people are lining up to give presents to the people getting married, the couple getting married, you no longer bring envelopes of cash. You bring a captured Russian soldier. $10,000. And Igor Kolomoisky has been offering $10,000 for each captured Russian soldier. So there you are. You can have a startup business with 2 of those. So Putin failed. He tried. In those, he never had any chance. In those 2, he tried in the spring and he wasn't successful. What happened was an upsurge in pro-Ukrainian Russian-speaking patriotism. We can thank again Putin for that in eastern and southern Ukraine. We saw that in September, just 2 months ago, where the biggest statue of Lenin was dismantled in Kharkiv, pulled down. So 25 years after the first one was pulled down in Stry, in Lvivsky Oblast. And since the Euromaidan, we've now had 450 Lenin monuments pulled down in eastern and southern Ukraine. So this is what we've had, I think, the good way for historians and others to look at it is, if in the late 1980s, it was West Ukrainians who propelled Ukraine to independence. By the year 2004, the Orange Revolution, the election of Yushchenko, it was Western and Central Ukrainians. And now with the Euromaidan and post-Euromaidan is Eastern and Southern Ukraine. So the national identity is spread throughout there. And you have, when you have a crisis like this, people who up until then didn't want to choose, they called themselves Russian Ukrainian, they had mixed identities, which is very common in Eastern Ukraine. They had to choose. Putin maybe thought they would choose pro-Russian, but the majority in East and Southern Ukraine chose pro-Ukrainian. Outside of the Donbass, which has always been different. And this I'll just explain to you. I was using this poster on the left in my book, which is coming out next year, this Contemporary History of Ukraine. And this is a poster from 1921. And just to show you how things sometimes stay very strong culturally on the ground, the photograph on the right is young people in the spring of this year saying basically the same thing. So the Donbass was always different in that sense. And they did have their own Soviet independent republic in 1918. Lenin did include them in Ukraine, in Soviet Ukraine, to give the Communist Party in Soviet Ukraine some greater influence. That was always the case of different. So, if you watch films on YouTube of Ukrainian volunteer battalions of the National Guard, you'll notice many of them are Russian speakers. It's not just Ukrainian speakers, many of them. There's been that upsurge has happened. Also this change was what happened is on the foreign policy front. The old idea where Ukraine was divided between whether it should go east or west is gone. It's finished. Consequence of many things, but certainly consequence of Euromaidan and post-Euromaidan crisis this year. This is the highest ever support for NATO membership in Ukraine. The previous highest was in the 1990s, under Kuchma about 30%. Now we're up to close to half of Ukrainians. That's as high as what you had in referendums in places like Hungary, Latvia, and Slovenia. And EU membership. So the pro-Russian sort of orientation is in effect being destroyed by a combination of 4 years of Yanukovych's mafia kleptocracy and Putin's intervention in Ukraine. And on that, I'll finish. Thank you.
My talk is on the Donbass and Russian responses to Euromaidan. And a quick summary of what I'm going to talk about. The departure of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych following the Euromaidan protests sparked an immediate reaction from the Russian Federation with the invasion of Crimea. And it was followed by separatist takeovers of government buildings in Donetsk and Luhansk, and a prolonged conflict involving Ukrainian government forces, separatist militias, and eventually the regular Russian army. So this talk examines the background to the conflict, the perspectives of Donbass residents, the formation of the People's Republics, quote-unquote, of Donetsk and Luhansk, the various stages of the conflict, and the respective roles of domestic and external factors. And I offer an assessment of the political and economic perspectives of Ukraine's eastern regions and the Crimea, and the goals of Vladimir Putin of Russia. In terms of background, I think the Crimea was probably the obvious place for the Russian backlash, which we remember came out of the Sochi Olympic Games, where Putin was obviously somewhat distracted. And the Crimea was vulnerable, I think, because of the presence of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. It had an ethnic Russian population at that time of about 55%, a Tatar population of roughly 14 or 15%, and the rest mainly Russian-speaking Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were taken by surprise, they didn't resist, and Crimea was rapidly incorporated through a referendum, the questions of which didn't really give them a great deal of choice. The first option was independence, and the second was complete autonomy from Ukraine, based on the constitution as it was back in 1992. In other words, there was nothing on the referendum about staying the same as it was before. There was the use of mercenaries in Crimea with experience in other battle sectors going back to the early 1990s. The Western response to the takeover of Crimea was one of absolute fury, but nevertheless quite limited. Russia was accused of illegally changing the borders of Europe. And this, of course, is a kind of controversial thing, because the Russians always respond that the borders of Europe changed in 2008 with the formation of the state of Kosovo, if you like, the second Albanian state. So Putin, in other words, argues that the Europeans did this first. The smoothness of the operation encouraged not only the Russian leadership, but also Russian nationalist circles to make further moves. And after Crimea, in April and May, there followed efforts to take over government buildings in other cities of eastern Ukraine. There were some successes, such as in the towns of the Donbass, but there were also notable failures, My favourite example actually was the city of Kharkiv, where the separatists taking over the government buildings actually took over the opera house by mistake. There were the bitter clashes in Odessa that Taras has described. But going back to the Donbass, it's an interesting region. It's the industrial heartland of Ukraine, and it's been that way since the 19th century. And it's very much an international and cosmopolitan part of the old Russian Empire. There was a lot of investment in Donbass by the French, the Germans, and the British, especially in steel and mining. And interestingly, both the major cities that we're talking about here, Donetsk and Luhansk, were founded by foreigners. Luhansk was actually founded by an Englishman. And perhaps better known, Donetsk was founded by John Hughes, a Welshman. And until the early 1920s, he was in fact known as literally Hughes-ovka, but of course you can't say that in Russian, so it was Hughes-ovka. And that was the original name of Donetsk. They were soon named after Stalin. In the case of Donetsk, it became Stalino, and Luhansk was named after his military leader, Voroshilov, or Voroshilov Grad. And it became the center of Soviet industrial development that started with the first 5-year plan. It was a critical area for coal and steel, and also later for chemicals. It was also the heart of the formation of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party of Ukraine. Two very well-known leaders of both the Soviet Union and Ukraine were raised in the Donbass, namely Nikita Khrushchev, although he was actually born in Russia, and Lazar Kaganovich, who was twice the party leader of Ukraine, and also, in fact, involved very much in the famine of Ukraine in 1932-33. Viktor Yanukovych was a third figure who was raised here. Since the late 1980s, there's been a backlash against perceived anti-communist sentiment in other parts of Ukraine. In 1991, when Ukraine was approaching a referendum on independence, Leonid Kravchuk, at that time the chairman of the parliament and the future first president, went to Donetsk to assure the residents that he would respect their demands for more autonomy, as well as more decision-making over their own affairs. Once Ukraine became independent, however, this was never put into practice. Donetsk remained powerful in the 1990s and had a rivalry with Dnipropetrovsk for what one might call business clans, if you like, mafia groups. In 2004, with the threat of autonomy in the latter stages of the Orange Revolution, there was a threat of autonomy in the Donbass region. It recovered, really, I think, after the fall of Viktor Yushchenko in 2010. Between 2010 and 2013, Donetsk was in fact the preeminent region of Ukraine in terms of leading positions in the government and presidency. Most of the cabinet came from here, as did the president and the prime minister. Also, the biggest businessman in Ukraine came from Donetsk, Rinok Akhmetov. His showpiece was Euro 2012, what you guys still call soccer, mistakenly, which is actually called football. And because he played with feet, right? Called football. And this marked the symbolic peak, I think, of the region. In a short time, Euromaidan reversed the privileged position of Donbass, removed the president, and appointed a cabinet without regional representatives, temporarily abrogated the language law that made Russian the state language in regions where more than 10% spoke it. I say temporarily because this law was rescinded only about 2 weeks later, but it had an enormous psychological impact on the population. There was a perception also of Euromaidan as a Western-inspired coup, aided by far-right nationalists from Western Ukraine. Notably, this was not a per se pro-Russian movement as Taras has suggested, I don't mean you suggested it was a pro-Russian movement. I mean, as you showed, it was not a pro-Russian movement, though the Soviet legacy and memories did remain very strong here. In April 2014, there was the start of the attempt to take over of eastern Ukraine, and the use of various elements of society in carrying that out. Former military men, malcontents, local gangsters, Russian ex-military, intelligence people who got together and formed local governments. Many of the military leaders who succeeded in the Crimea moved directly to the Donbass. They established what were called people's governments, or people's republics. Opposition was rounded up, sometimes kidnapped, sometimes shot, most often forced to flee. And for a time, the idea of Novorossiya embraced quite a large portion of these groups. A mythical perception of the past embraced by Eurasianists in Moscow and other cities, by philosophers such as Alexander Dugin and others at Moscow State University and other centers. However, the extent of the disaffection, as has just been shown, was largely limited to these two oblasts of Ukraine. And elsewhere, polls carried out by the Kiev Institute of Sociology and others suggest that while the Donbass had disaffection for the events in Kiev, they were not necessarily pro-Russia either. Regions such as Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, Mykolaiv, Dnipropetrovsk were very much in favor of remaining in Ukraine. Even in the Donbass itself, very few people wanted a Russian invasion. Mainly, the demand was for more autonomy or federalization. The mix of goals in the Donbass is summarized by an acronym I think I invented, but I don't know whether I invented it, called FAST. In other words, federalists, autonomists, separatists, and terrorists. When I mentioned this to Taras, he came back with his own version of what FAST stood for, but I couldn't repeat it in this format. In summer 2014, there were two major events: attempts to consolidate control by pro-Russians with deeper Russian involvement. Most important was the role of this man, Igor Girkin, whose nickname is Strelkov, or sharpshooter. They really represented the peak of the Novorossiya campaign. The response of Kiev after the election of Poroshenko was to try to get rid of these areas by force, bombing Donbass towns and cities, and retaking one settlement after another in turn. The response of Moscow to the attack by Atto was a reluctance to indulge completely in the desires of people like Girkin Strelkov, or by his close friend Alexander Borodar, another Moscow-born, if you like, right-wing intellectual with a degree in philosophy from Moscow State University. Even Girkin himself is quite an intellectual, although I would say of a rather limited kind. In other words, he has his own view of the world. He was in Bosnia, took part in some of the fighting there, he was involved in Crimea, and he's basically been involved in every area where Russian expansion has taken place, including Transnistria, where Borodar is also involved. But I would say that their views were not completely followed by those leaders in Moscow. At first, I think the weaknesses of the Ukrainian army were not fully apparent, but it emerged that at times the army was divided, that the officers and the troops often didn't see eye to eye. Some of the leaders of the Ukrainian army, the officers, were Soviet trained, they were corrupt, and they used the attack to make their own profits, as Taras mentioned, sometimes even in trading in officers, sometimes in equipment. And it's because of the disillusionment of some of these troops, I think, that volunteer battalions were formed to defend Ukraine. Critically, the border of Ukraine was never sealed at any time during this conflict, and it led to the decisive battle at Ilovaisk in late August, when Ukrainian armed troops and volunteer battalions were cut off and surrounded, with several hundred killed. And they were killed, most of them, during an orderly retreat, which had been allegedly authorized by Vladimir Putin. And these troops described how they were taken and found themselves in a field surrounded by forests, and then all the soldiers with unmarked uniforms suddenly came out to this forest, and they had no idea that they were there, and then simply opened up fire. And that is how they were killed. This battle caused tremendous shock in Ukraine. And it changed the situation completely. It brought respite to the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics after what has seen an almost victorious campaign. It was decisive also because of after endless provocations by Russia, including the long convoys of aid trucks. For the first time, Russian regular army troops had entered eastern Ukraine. The invasion was somewhat limited. The number of troops at that time indicated that their goals were somewhat limited to the area. That is, there was no plan at this time in late August, September, to move out of Donbass to other areas of Ukraine. There simply were not enough troops in there for a longer campaign. It also raises the question, which many people I'm sure have asked, what are the goals of Vladimir Putin? And I've tried to make them rather simplistic, although I would say, first of all, that none of these goals are deeply implanted in Putin himself. I don't think he has any serious long-term plan. Basically, I would put them as follows. First of all, maintain the separatist regimes in power, especially after the new elections on November the 2nd, and introduce a frozen conflict in eastern Ukraine as a bargaining tool with the government in Kiev. Second, weaken the Ukrainian government decisively, not necessarily permanently, but as far as Putin's concerned, that wouldn't matter either, and prevent its wholesale move toward the European Union and the West. Third, ensure that Ukraine cannot fulfill all the functions of its association agreement with the EU, especially the trading agreement, or Article 4 of the official agreement. Fourth, foster the notion that Ukraine cannot survive on its own as a state without aid from Russia, or as part, and well, actually that leads me into the fifth one, pressure Ukraine from withdrawing from the EU and moving into the Eurasian Economic Community. Sixth, ensuring that Ukraine doesn't join NATO. And seventh, discrediting the Euromaidan as an extremist uprising financed by the West. And that, in a nutshell, is how I perceive Putin's perspective. But I would say that it could change tomorrow and be completely different. Added to the above are symbolic aggressive moves by Russia. For example, the illegal entry of military planes into the airspace of NATO countries, such as the Baltic states, Sweden, that's right, Sweden's not NATO country, I forget that, but Norway, Poland. A constant propaganda barrage against the West. A crackdown on independent media, social media, and informal groups, NGOs, and a portrayal of Western society as a whole as fundamentally decadent. Atheists with deviant sexual tendencies, and yet ironically, despite these deviances, intent on further expansion eastward. At the same time, Putin has made a sustained effort to pressure European leaders into changing course, into abandoning sanctions, and using the threat of reduction or the cut-off of energy supplies. And these are quite effective. Countries such as Slovakia, Hungary, and even the Czech Republic are thinking of changing course and lifting the sanctions imposed on Russia. For the Donbass today, though, the situation is simply disastrous. About 1 million displaced persons are floundering in Ukraine alone. Thousands more have fled to Russia. Industries are suffering. Towns and cities are being bombed to oblivion. And the residents are without heat, water, and food as winter approaches. The governor of Dnipropetrovsk, Kolomoisky, whose oblast had over 400,000 displaced persons from the Donbass by late October, compared the situation with Leningrad during the siege of 1941 in terms of the suffering caused. So finally, some options. How can Ukraine respond to this situation? It has a new president, or a relatively new president. It has a parliament in which the Regions Party is no longer a factor. The communists are gone, and the opposition are reduced to a fragment of their former force. But the coalition may face problems because of the diversity of views within. Poroshenko is looking for peaceful solutions. He agreed, for example, in September to sign the Minsk Protocol. Very interesting affair, by the way. The host of this protocol is that great Democrat Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus. The Ukrainian representative of this protocol was Leonid Kuchma, once thought to be really one of the worst figures in Ukraine, the most corrupt figure himself in Ukraine. He was negotiating as a past president. The concessions to the republics was made in this protocol by the fact that their leaders were physically present and signed it from both Donetsk and Luhansk. Poroshenko also failed on missions to Washington and Ottawa, where he asked for military aid. In the parliament, Yatsenyuk's group, the Popular Front, seemingly more militant, with the idea to restart the war to free the Donbass, and with the support of more radical elements in Ukraine. But what can actually be done with the Donbass? I think there are a few options. I've basically got three altogether. First of all, to allow the Donbass to become more autonomous, allow the leaders to sell their coal, resources and steel to Kiev and elsewhere, and reduce tensions with Russia. This would also mean abandoning radical reforms and the movement to the west, and maybe also the idea of ending the influence of oligarchs and corruption in Ukraine. It would keep the status quo more or less for some time, and it would allow the frozen conflict to continue. But it would lead to disaffection among more radical Euromaidan elements, who would see this as a betrayal of the civil revolution in Ukraine. It could also undermine Poroshenko as the president, or force him into more severe measures. Second, more radical measures could be taken. A full-scale movement to the west, albeit without firm military backing, efforts to join NATO, a resumption of hostilities to regain eastern Ukraine and Crimea. This, I think, is frankly a route to self-destruction and the permanent division of Ukraine. This may also give rise to a kind of compromise solution, which would be to actually give up the territories over which Ukraine has not complete control. In other words, abandon Crimea and abandon Donbass, and with the rest of Ukraine, renegotiate with both the Europeans and with NATO for full membership. That, I think, may seem outrageous to most people of Ukrainian background here. I'm absolutely certain it does. But it's also, I think, one thing that might actually work. But there is a kind of middle ground solution, a third solution, which requires, first of all, economic recovery, the gradual reduction of debts, currency stabilization, meeting some of the demands of the separatists without recognizing their regimes. It means continuing to work with both sides, with both the EU and the Russian Federation, to reach a solution. The great failing of this route is the need to continue negotiations with people like Putin and Lavrov, as well as the leaders of the two breakaway republics. This, by the way, is one of them. Igor Plotnitsky. I don't know, a picture tells a lot, I think, when you look at one like this. You can tell a lot about the personality of Plotnitsky. But he looks like Tony Soprano, yeah, he does. You're late, Thomas. Right, I should say. It also, the advantages of this idea are that most Russians themselves appear reluctant to escalate the war in Ukraine or sacrifice their own troops for such missions. Another, what you might call a positive from the Ukrainian perspective, is the growing decline of Russia's economy. As a result, less of sanctions, I think, than the fall in the world prices of oil and gas. Incidentally, these are also affecting my own province of Alberta, so it's not something we necessarily support. Russia has also lost foreign markets, and its own oligarchs are considerably weakened by the sanctions that have taken place. And actually, as many people have pointed out, Putin, as a leader of a military force, is punching well above his own weight. Russia, even as an economy, is only about 2/3 the size of the European Union, let alone comparable with the United States. This is not a global power today. It's a regional power acting as a global power. And I think there's a significant difference. Ukraine of 1991, this is coming to the conclusion, probably cannot be restored. The irony is that if the conflict is prolonged in Ukraine, Russia will get weaker and will be less able to support the separatist regimes, which are much more feeble than they appear. They lack infrastructure, support, qualified personnel, and resources suffering even more in a conflict situation. The coal industry of Ukraine may never recover. It was in trouble before all these events took place. It was in trouble even at the end of the Soviet period. But now it may well be simply finished as a major industry. Ultimately, I think Russia needs stability in Ukraine. Russia is less monolithic than it appears. There are ultra-nationalists in Russia, they get a lot of publicity, who are prepared to go much further than their president and his security service backers. The Russian oligarchs, who back Putin, on the other hand, are looking for economic security and stability rather than imperial dreams of a symbolic quest to vanquish the corrupt West and regain former Soviet lands. Russia is also very dependent on the global economy. The purchases of its energy resources today include countries such as Germany and Turkey, in addition to Ukraine. Germany, I would argue, is the biggest player in the European Union. So it's illogical to think that Russia can permanently alienate these nations and expect to make profits from the sale of energy sources. Conversely, as mentioned, these states don't want a long-term conflict in Russia. Lastly, I would say that some of the problems of Donbass are a result of neglect by independent Ukraine. The rapaciousness of the business clans, the destruction of the military attack over the past summer, but perhaps most of all, the failure to resolve problems that have existed for the past quarter of a century. Back in 1989, if we remember, I can remember, one of the first trips I made to Ukraine was in 1989. At the Root Congress, there was a rift that developed between its leaders and the Donbass coal miners, who attended this Congress, discovered that they couldn't make any common language with the participants, and then simply left again. The Yushchenko period also, there's a failure to reach, I think, a consensus about where Ukraine should be going today and what kind of Ukraine people should be seeking. And my last comment would be, with all due respect, at least to Bandera, that Ukrainians would better, if they want a national symbol, I would stick to the one they've got. Taras Shevchenko would have united all Ukraine. Thank you very much.
I want to say that it's a big honor for me to to be among so prominent scholars, and of course I consider it to be a good sign that when Ukraine is in question, it is symbolically represented, so I can be a silent reminder. Come on, I'm from Kharkiv, I live in Kiev, so please mind what you're saying. And of course thanking my colleagues for their very insightful, sometimes very discussable, but still very engaging presentations. And I'm absolutely sure that you've got a lot of questions, and we are about to open the floor for the Q&A section, and so you should think about how to formulate your questions in the most crisp manner. And as soon as you do, you should raise your hand, and our volunteers with the microphones will come up to you, and you'll have an opportunity to do so. And while you are thinking, I want to use this time to pose the first several questions. As a footnote, I think I must say the reputation of the philosophical community that it's not only Dugin or Borodai, that there are a lot of decent people among my colleagues, and now I want to pose such questions because I think that there are 2 points, 2 blind spots, that is Putin and Euromaidan, which are, the core subjects of our discussion. So I'll think about my questions around these 2 points. And the first one is about Euromaidan. As Taras pointed out, that it was a special situation when elites had to pay some attention to people. I wouldn't even call it a civil society because it was rather civil activism. It was not structured and institutionalized in a way, and the authorities, the ruling elites, had to follow the people, and it was a very unusual situation for political science in general because we're usually talking about elites as decision makers. And right now it looks like it's gone. So my question is, how can it be used, this symbolic capital, these human resources, how not only new faces might be recruited from this, Maidan community, but how can the principles, the rules of governing change? So is there a chance to change something in these terms? And the second question would be rather fantastic. What do you think? We usually say Putin's Russia, but if we try to separate them, so if we just imagine that Putin were gone, and it's not the kind of wishful thinking, it's just an analytic procedure, what would be with Russia? What would really be changed? So if you have some reactions, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure. Would you want to collect some questions?
No, we're just waiting for this to think about the questions, and if you have something to comment on these ideas.
I don't think that I don't think that whatever you want to call it, civil activism or civil society has gone. The one thing that Ukrainians have learned from the Orange Revolution and Yushchenko was that after the Orange Revolution, everybody went home and thought that the new Tsar, Yushchenko, would take care of everything, which was a very Soviet approach, of course. They realized very quickly that was mistaken, and that they have to continue to be around and to apply pressure. So the pressure will remain on President Poroshenko and the Ukrainian government. We do have a unique situation where you have a pro-European parliament and Prime Minister and President all pretty much thinking along similar lines. I mean, all of the things I listed don't really raise many conflicts. The conflicts are going to be all more in the realm of fighting corruption, really, not on basic economic and political points. The situation is so bad economically and financially that there's no choice but to do reforms. Where I'm more skeptical and where there will be, I think, civil society and citizens' pressure and anger inside the Ukrainian parliament, because there have been new political forces, the new face in the Ukrainian parliament is this political force called Samopomic, self-reliant, self-help, led by Lviv mayor, Andrei Sadovey, who has a very good reputation in Lviv. which in Ukrainian translation means he's not corrupt. And you also have civil society activists and journalists elected in all of the major pro-European forces in parliament, plus military commanders, national volunteer battalion commanders. The kind of compromises that David spelled out are interesting intellectually, but are going to be impossible for Poroshenko to undertake because simply the volunteer battalions will never allow it. You have a lot of guns in Ukraine today. Many of those people who became volunteers in the battalions which are part of the National Guard had to buy a lot of their military equipment themselves because the Ukrainian state is so weak. I think pressure will come from a variety of places. There will be protests outside the Ukrainian parliament to implement illustration, particularly against the opposition bloc. So I think President Poroshenko will be under more pressure than Prime Minister Yatsenyuk. I think Prime Minister Yatsenyuk will be under pressure from the IMF, European Union, to produce results and to not expect a free lunch from Western assistance. But President Poroshenko will be under pressure, even more difficult pressure, to show results about fighting corruption. And I'm actually more skeptical about his ability to do that, on the fighting of corruption.
I'll take on question 2 then. I think, if you look at what will happen after Putin, my first question might be, first response might be, what was it like before Putin? And I think, the problem is that most Russians remember the 1990s as a time of total financial chaos, if not actual collapse. 1998, in fact, there was an enormous financial collapse. A run on the Russian ruble, several banks disappeared. Yeltsin at that time was a kind of bumbling alcoholic who was absent from his office for most of the time. And Putin was in fact the only friend he got left by the end of the 1990s. Nobody knew anything about him. And he became popular because he actually stabilized Russia, made an effort to get rid of some of the most offensive oligarchs, in his view. And Russia, with the rise in the oil and gas prices in the 1990s, became a much more economically stable environment. And I think that is why Putin stayed in power. However, in 2008, there was a lot of opposition to Putin in Moscow and other areas of Russia. Protests in Russia were reaching hundreds of thousands of people. It looked like the end for Putin. And Putin managed to wriggle out of this situation by this new kind of imperial upsurge, if you like. Let's retake what we had. Let's stop the advance of NATO eastward. The West is going to try to make hay while the sun is shining. We have to take our opportunities when we get them. Added to that, the biggest propaganda drive since, I would say, even since the Stalinist period in the Soviet Union. If you read the Russian media today, it's like something from fantasy. There's no even semblance of reality in most of their media. There's maybe, I think, 2 newspapers that actually are in the opposition. There's 1 radio station, but even they are under intense pressure. Independent journalists in Russia have disappeared regularly, on a regular basis. Most of them assassinated, some have simply lost their jobs. It's almost complete control over the media. So what I would suggest is that most Russians today believe Putin when he talks about Novorossiya, about the need to regain past empire and Russian glory. That's not to say that most Russians are bad, it's to say that they're susceptible to propaganda. Most people are, especially if they get it all day, every day. They see pictures on the TV screen which appear to support the statements made by Moscow. And they have been doctored quite regularly. At one time we saw people leaving from the Donbass region into Russia. It appeared on the Russian news that they were going over the border into Poland. Photographs can be easily doctored. Never trust a photograph if you're a sort of analyst, political scientist, historian, or whatever. They're the easiest things to change. Films can be changed. So all this actually gives Russia a completely false impression of what has been taking place. That's not to say that our media is completely honest, because it isn't. Neither is the Ukrainian media. But the Russian media is not just dishonest, it's simply absolutely outrageously dishonest. But it's also very pervasive. Most Russians watch TV. Anywhere, the smallest village in Russia, they will watch TV. They see Putin every day. He's empowered by the security services, he's quite secure right now. If he goes, there'll be someone else quite like him in his place.
It's just to add on that, everything that David said is true, but this kind of thing can happen in Western societies. Propaganda was so big in the U.S. In 2001, 2002 that most Americans believed that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11, which was obviously not true. But I remember being startled by surveys saying that 2/3 of Americans believe that. So people want to believe something. This is the case in Russia. They want to believe that this is a Western plot against Russia, that the West is trying to put Russia down all the time. They try to do that now. And Putin is dragging up Russia from its knees. And that's good. And these democratic revolutions are fascist, Western-backed putschs. So people want to believe it, so they believe it.
Thank you for your answers. And now I'm welcoming you to join our discussion.
My question is directed to both of you, gentlemen. You could probably give me a little bit of guidance on this, but before I continue, I'd like to thank the organizers for having this wonderful symposium and having you present, where we can talk to Ukrainians about Ukraine instead of talking to Moscow about Ukraine. We got to change that scenario. But my question to you is, regardless of how much land grab Putin takes, and I understand the economy is suffering, I understand the oil prices are going down, but the reality is, as long as people are not free, things will never change. Because I'm going to use an example of serfdom. You have the landlord, you have the serf. The landlord owns the markets, the gas stations, so the money keeps going back and forth from the landlord to the consumer and back to the landlord. So the middle class has no way of rising. So there's a fallacy in his thinking. If he will let his people free and leave us alone, he can do much better as Ukraine being a good neighbor to him and he being a good neighbor to Ukraine, where we all have the freedom to trade with whomever we want. The second point I'd like to make this quick is, when are we going to bring Yanukovych back for trial for the murder of thousands of people? When are we going to, I forgot what I was going to say, Yanukovych? And the third point is, nobody talks about the persecution of the Catholic Church, or not just the Catholic Church, but all the churches, religious, including the Jews, on the eastern part of Ukraine. From what I understand is, when the separatists took over, number one, the Ukrainian language was forbidden, the churches were closed down, and they were treating the Jews again where they were numbered. They had to report to the mayor. Whether it's all true, I don't know, but I think that being a past history of Putin and the Soviet Union, I think that people that are occupied by Russia are probably reverting back to what it was in the 30s.
Thank you. You gave us a number of issues already to answer. Do you want to collect several questions from the audience?
We can accept one.
Yes.
We can accept one, and then we'll respond.
Yeah, you talked about the failure of national security for Ukraine and all of that, but there was a big part of that national security was the Budapest Memorandum, which is being grossly violated and basically disregarded by both Russia and Western powers. So in view of that, do you think it will be justifiable for Ukraine to eventually restore nuclear power capability? And basically, it may not happen under Poroshenko, but given the messages and everything that happened, it's going to happen one way or another. Thank you.
Maidan San Diego. I do have a question, and thank you so much, Taras and David, for your overview. You gave us an idea of possible scenarios of how things can play out in Ukraine. My question is about outside influences and contingencies. And obviously, you mentioned some economic relations that do play a role. But what about political influences? Maybe you can speak to U.S. influence, European influence of the West, and what are the forces that can help facilitate these democratic processes in Ukraine towards the West. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we'll take a question from the gentleman and then try to stop.
Well, isn't this a phenomenal affair? Especially that a graduate or a professor of a university that I'm an alumni of, University of Alberta, I did have those 40 below experiences. Anyway, my question is this. I understand that Russia's economic power is gas and oil. And being the best of Russia's clients, first is Germany, and then there's Ukraine. But they're only 0.5% away as far as importance is concerned. Ukraine gets 29.8% of the gas and oil that Russia exports. And I suspect, and I don't know if that is true or not, but I'd like to hear you mention it and discuss it, that Putin not only is doing a political gamble, but he's also doing an economic gamble. Why I say that? Russia wants to maintain its monopoly of gas and oil going through Ukraine to the rest of Europe. But recently, the oil companies like Shell Oil and a number of others have found that there is oil and gas reserves in which area? But the Donbass, Donetsk, Luhansk area. And in 2015, 2016, and 2017, Shell Oil and a number of other companies were supposed to start their gas and oil exploration in that area. Now, if the oligarchs found that the oil is not coming from Russia, but is coming from Ukraine to Germany and Ukraine and others, would that not be a motivator to go in and destabilize that whole area so that they can not lose their monopoly in the economy? I'd love to hear your answer. Thank you so much.
A few of the domestic issues. Firstly on religion. The biggest influence this conflict and these crises are going to have is not on the Ukrainian Catholic Church, it's on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is under the Moscow Patriarchate. Ukraine has more Orthodox parishes than Russia has. You might not believe that, but Ukraine has the biggest Orthodox churches in the world. It has two main churches. In opinion polls, the Kiev Patriarch has always had more believers than the Russian or the so-called Ukrainian Orthodox Church. But the irony is that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarch has the majority of its parishes in so-called Orange Ukraine, or Central Ukraine, because that's where the main religious believers exist, not in eastern and southern Ukraine. And so you have a lot of divisions now appearing within that umbrella of a church. and inevitably there are going to be splits that are very opposed to what's taking place. You have on the other side, in the Donetsk region controlled by separatists, you have Russian Orthodox priests blessing separatist military terrorists, just as you had in, for example, Yugoslavia with Serbian priests. So that church is already on the verge of splitting, I think, in Ukraine, and these policies inevitably will mean that, and the pro-Ukrainian side of that Russian Orthodox Church will probably eventually team up with the Kiev Patriarch. So that's a big major crisis for Russia, because religion and national identity are very closely intertwined, and for the Putin's idea of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, it incorporates not only Russia, it incorporates the three Eastern Slavic countries, and it incorporates the Russian Orthodox Church, not as a church for Russia, but as a church for Russian speakers and for the Eastern Slavic world. In that sense, it's a more of an aggressive church than the Serbian church, which is just for Serbs. There's a separate churches for other Slavs in Yugoslavia. On energy, the biggest problem with energy, as I mentioned, which you didn't mention in your question, is that Ukrainian leaders have been involved in corruption, as well as Russian leaders throughout this period of time. All Ukrainian presidents. There's a 2008 WikiLeaks US cable from Kiev where Dmytro Firtash, who's a West Ukrainian, by the way, from Ternopil Oblast, and he's now waiting on bail in very luxurious surroundings of the Ritz Hotel in Vienna before he's deported to the US to stand trial. He brags in 2008 to the US ambassador in Ukraine that Viktor Yushchenko is one of his best friends. And a year later, Yushchenko gives him a state medal for providing financial support for the rebuilding of a Cossack encampment. So Ukrainian elites need to also change their approach to corruption, because once you have corruption in place, then you have compromat. The Russian leaders have control over you. They have control over your foreign policy. So hopefully that's changed. What hasn't changed is how bad Ukrainians are at negotiating gas contracts. And that's still there, sadly. On the political on political influences, well, I mean, that really takes place where there are large Ukrainian diaspora communities. US, Canada, Britain I don't really hear about Ukrainian communities lobbying German or Italian communities to such a degree. But what will obviously change in the US now is that the Republicans control both houses. They will adopt a far more aggressive posture in support of Ukraine. Not only just because they want to support Ukraine, but they want to stick it to Obama, of course. And so I think, from what I was just in Washington on Monday and Tuesday speaking, and from what I understand, there's already covert support happening, but that will increase because there may be the adoption of a Ukraine Freedom Act, similar to the Belarusian Freedom Act adopted in the US Congress. But as for Ukrainian leaders, my experience has always been is that, and we talked about this over lunch, Ukrainian political elites don't like to listen to Western advice. They like to take our money, but they don't like to listen. And this is a very big cultural problem that's, I think, difficult to overcome. Just quickly on the Donbass, what hasn't come out is that Russian separatists or backed separatists only control a third of Donbass. This is what makes the ceasefire very unstable. They hoped to not only get Novorossiya, so-called, which they didn't get, but they didn't even get control of the whole of Donbass. Ukrainian forces control still 2/3 of Donbass, and they control the second largest city, Mariupol. So that's what always therefore raises the question, will they try to expand their territory?
Yeah, actually I was thinking about the same thing, that Mariupol, I think, is the focal point of the current Russian build-up in eastern Ukraine. Is this on, Mother? Can you hear? Okay. That's why I think, we're talking about Russian, some kind of Russian move over this weekend. It wouldn't surprise me if the two goals for that city and the airport in been done yet. I think Russia desperately needs support in that part of Ukraine in order to feed the Crimeans. That is a big problem. To get food and water to Crimea, logistically, it's quite a big problem for Russia right now. In terms of the first question was about if people are not free, well, nothing will change, and brought up the old Russian serfdom in Ukraine. And I think it's true. The question is, what do people actually want? And that's a bigger question. Do they want democracy? Are they interested in emulating Western societies? They see the benefits of Western societies, but not necessarily the benefits of democracy. And I think, unfortunately, the first experiments in democratic, pro-market movements in that part of the world were almost unequivocally disastrous. All of them. In Belarus, which we've mentioned before, that period between 1991 and 1994, when there was a movement, say, towards democracy before the dictatorship took hold, was the economically most disastrous period in the history of that republic, even including Soviet rule. So the experience is so bad that they simply don't want to go back. It's more or less like we tried that and it doesn't work. And I think in terms of election campaigns, the most popular thing to say in an election is that we will guarantee your economic stability, that your kids can be well educated, that you can work, you will all get pensions and benefits. And that's all most people want right now. You will not persuade Russians that democracy is better than the system they have right now. That's not to say it isn't. I think it's just a fact. It won't win an election. That is why in Belarus, Lukashenko's been there for 20 years. Because he brings stability, he brings order, and there's peace there. There's no fighting there. And there are no oligarchs. No oligarchs. And unfortunately, the way that Russia and Ukraine have developed has been for a complete inequality of wealth distribution in the independence period. Most people are pretty poor, a few people are extremely rich. And they're rich by Hollywood-style standards. These people are multi-billionaires. And people see the inequality and they don't like it. It was better in the old days. It was even better under Stalin. People forget what happened under Stalin, but that is actually quite a frequent comment. So we need to be more persuasive, I think, if we're going to suggest that our system is worth following, and that will only bring freedom. In terms of the Budapest Memorandum and Putin disavowing treaties, once again, it comes back to treaties that he alleges the West broke first. 1982, for example, which he claims was broken, and Kosovo, as I mentioned before, already formed. In other words, that these treaties are not worth the paper that they're written on. In terms of nuclear weapons, I would suggest that that's something you might think about very carefully. Are nuclear weapons ever going to be used? Would anybody here like to see nuclear weapons used in anything other than a kind of deterrence mode? But I think you have to think that far ahead. If you're talking about nuclear weapons, you have to think about how they would be used. So personally, I know that nuclear weapons appears like a good solution for Ukraine, allows it to stand up for itself. But it means obliteration if it's ever used. Absolute, total obliteration. I wouldn't advise it. I simply wouldn't. Russia might threaten to use nuclear weapons. I very much doubt it would. I think the problem is that Ukraine is not in NATO, and there are no immediate prospects for NATO expansion. NATO is only prepared to defend those countries that are part of the alliance. And even then, NATO kind of woke up late to this crisis. It's not ready, which is why Russia's getting away with all these nasty little side swipes, flying the planes into different places, sending their warships into Sydney Harbour and things like that. This is really ridiculous, I think, in terms of real threats. But they think they can do it and get away with it because NATO is simply not prepared to use force. The biggest problem for me, personally, was when Obama, it's not to say I dislike Obama, I regard him as a foreign president who was properly elected, he told Putin that he would never resort to force to defend Ukraine. That, in my view, was his big mistake. You don't say to Putin what you won't do. Let him continue thinking that you simply might do it. And that would have worked, I believe. The threat of force with Putin would have worked. A complete revocation of any possibility of force. Putin thinks, it's my lucky day. Nobody's going to stop me. I can do anything I want. So that's where I see Putin's situation right now. I don't want to wander too far off topic because I know there was another question. The political force of the West, well, we already did that one. Oil and gas. There, I think, Taras mentioned somewhat about the corruption of Ukrainian-controlled industries. This is short-term as well. Oil and gas is not a long-term solution, I think. These energy resources are going to run out. Ukraine, I think, could do a lot more towards self-sufficiency in energy resources. And I don't mean necessarily expanding nuclear power. It uses more energy than we do in Canada per person. And this is kind of outrageous. We have -40 winters. And our country is simply thousands of miles from one side to the other. We need a lot of these resources. Ukraine shouldn't. And I think energy saving should be the first thing. Cut down reliance on Russian oil and gas as far as possible. Look for alternative sources. Look for energy saving. Ukraine, I think, could get out of this mess that it's in. It is in a terrible mess. And I think debt is the first thing, stabilizing the currency, building up its foreign reserves. All these are critical factors for Ukraine today. And one reason, why Putin is disturbing all this is that he knows this. If the Ukrainian economy recovers, Ukraine can be a very strong state within Europe. But it's never really had a chance in the past 25 years. Either the leaders have been corrupt, or they haven't been very efficient, or they've been distracted by all kinds of political infighting and other nonsense. So I think that's probably why it's struggling.
Thank you so much. Obviously, your questions were so interesting that our speakers wanted to talk more and more and to explain and to go into some details. Take my apologies for those of you who didn't have a chance to pose a question, but unfortunately we are out of time. But we can. Well, I think we can continue this discussion behind these doors because we are not saying goodbye to each other right now. So, what's the best question?
Yeah. I have the next slide. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for engaging. Thank you for